Hello, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I'm the Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation located in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm also the Director of the Center for Education, Leadership, and Culture. As you know, every month we get together and we bring together interesting people who work in the field of education and who talk about ideas related to civil society. And this month is no different. As part of Black History Month and our celebration of the role that Black people have played in investing in American culture, and particularly in American education, we've got three people today who are going to talk to us about their work, about what they do, and why it makes a difference. Um, Professor Alridge, Monica, and John, you are now welcome to go ahead and to join us. For those of you who are watching, thank you again for doing so. When we think about Black History Month, again, it's a slice in time for us to talk about our contributions. But education has played such a tremendous role in the lives of people of African descent, both here in the United States, in the Caribbean, South America, Canada, and really around the world. But today I want to talk about education. K-12 naturally will be a part of the conversation, but there's also some aspects of it that higher education will play a role as well. And so with that, I have three people with me. First is Dr. Derrick Alridge, who is a professor of education at the University of Virginia. He's also the director of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. We also have Secretary of Education John King, who is now the president and CEO of Education Trust. And we have Monica Washington, who is the manager of inclusion and responsive educational practices at Better Education. And she's also the 2014 Teacher of the Year for the state of Texas. I know she's in Texas right now, so I'm glad you're doing well. And we've kept a lot of people in Texas in our prayers because the things that have taken place in your state. And so with that, I want to welcome all of you to our monthly seminar. Thank you for having us. So Black History Month was created by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He is the son of enslaved Africans here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He is an author and an educator. He's also the founder of the study of African American history, life and history. He's also the second Black to receive a PhD from Harvard. Through his research, through his work, he was really clear that education played a tremendous role in setting a pathway for Black people to pursue economic and political mobility. And again, education was one pathway. Before we get started to the general questions, I always like to ask an individual question of everyone. And that one really is, how did you get to the point you're in today? What questions, what people, what circumstances actually motivated you or attracted you to the field of education? And it gives the viewing audience and those who will view and listen later an opportunity to know more about you than what they would see on your CV or what they may know about you now. And so we'll start with you, Secretary King. Who is John? How did he get involved in education?
Sure. Well, thanks, Gerard, for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Looking forward to it. Uh, my path to education when I started with my parents, who are both teachers. My father was African American, grew up just after the turn of the 20th century in a very segregated New York City, and saw a path to opportunity as a teacher and then principal. My mother was born in Puerto Rico, came to New York as a kid, and learned English in New York City public schools and became a teacher and a counselor. And so school was very much a part of my life as a little kid, and that's what was talked about at the dinner table every night. But my parents couldn't have known the difference school would make in my life. They both passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And the thing that saved me was New York City public school teachers who made school this place that was safe and compelling and engaging and a place where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. And so later, when I was figuring out what I wanted to do, I started actually in college volunteering with young people and really could see how satisfying it was to try to do for other kids what great teachers had done for me. And that really drove my passion for teaching and drove me to be a teacher and principal and ultimately to work on education policy.
Thanks for sharing that story. So we'll go to Monica. Who is Monica? How did you arrive here?
Yeah. Thanks also for having me, and thank you for the great introduction. For me, I think I'm one of those people who I'm not from a long line of family educators. My mom always says I'll stick to the hospital stuff. She's a nurse. She's like, I'll leave that to someone else. But she inspired in me a love of education. I remember being in element, well, even before elementary school, when I was just really probably preschool, going to the library with her, and it would be an adventure to go figure out which books we would pick out. So she would always go to the mystery section, I would go to fiction, and then we would go and get Krispy Kreme and sit in the park and read. And so that really inspired a love of reading for me. And then I had a fourth grade teacher at the time. Her name was Miss Elian. She's got married. She's Mrs. Askew now, but she made me love school even more than I had before. She was my first Black teacher. And she had a way of making everybody in the classroom feel like they were the favorite. Now, looking back on that, I'm 46 years old now, I realize I probably wasn't her favorite. But she made sure that we all felt like a favorite. She made sure that when we walked into the classroom, we felt powerful and we could do anything. And she made me see myself in the things that we were doing. And so I wanted to create spaces like that for my students. And that I've carried that feeling with me all these years. She showed up at my high school graduation. She was that person, or is that person. And so now I support teachers to create those same types of spaces where students walk in feeling warm and feeling as though they can thrive and survive, not just survive, but thrive in the space. And so started with my mom and that love of reading, and then to Miss Elian, to now just like trying to replicate that feeling for so many students that I come in contact with and with teachers that I work with. So that's why I'm here.
You're in Texas now. Did you grow up in Texas?
I did not. Miss Elian, I'm from Memphis, born and raised there, and I didn't move to Texas until I was in my 30s. So yeah, Texas has adopted me, but my hometown is Memphis, Tennessee, and that was public schools, Memphis City Schools, where I spent my whole K-12 experience and college. Went to Lemoyne College as well there. Yes, shout out to Memphis. I see in the chat, South Memphis at that. So yeah, that's hometown. That's who raised me.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Professor Aldridge, we know you're a professor. Who's Derrick?
All right. So thank you, Gerard, for the invitation to join this esteemed panel and to be here with you today as well. So I was raised in a family of teachers as well. And my mother and aunts were teachers, and most of the people in my neighborhood were either teachers, principals, or professors. So I grew up around educators, and I admired the way that they carried themselves. I admired their educational attainment. And I was also impressed with the respect they garnered in my small community in South Carolina, a town called Rock Hill, South Carolina. And so for a kid growing up in the South in the aftermath of the civil rights era, education was viewed not only as a career, but as a means of entering and maintaining one's status in the middle class. So that was my first engagement with education, just in my neighborhood and with the people around me and my family members. So I went on from there and majored in history at Winthrop College, which is now Winthrop University, where I became a certified teacher, taught for a few years. After that, went to Penn State, where I also received my PhD in education with a focus in the history of education, because I was very interested in the history of educational thinkers, but more specifically, the history of teachers. And so here I am. I taught at University of Georgia for 14 years, and I've been at UVA for 10 years. And I currently direct a project on teachers. Many of those teachers that I grew up with, I have interviewed them several times for a major project, research project called Teachers in the Movement. So as you can see, teaching and education is in my blood, like it is my panelists as well.
Well, it's good to have that kind of DNA, and all of you talked about the importance of teachers and what role they played in your life, and you all talked about your educational experience. For a number of Black students today, their experiences in education is very different. Some of them come from a home where there may be one or two people who are high school graduate, in some cases, no graduate at all. Others are in schools where, in homes where education is important, but maybe sports is a little better. You know, when we think about Black History Month and we think about education, and even some of the things that Dr. Carter G. Woodson mentioned, whether it was, his book on the miseducation of the Negro or other works. From the lanes that you walk today, what are some of the wins that we see taking place right now for Black students in schools? And what are some of the challenges? Monica, we'll start with you and then we'll go around.
I'll start with wins. I think wins for sure fall in the category of questioning. I think that there are more of us in education now who are questioning the system itself, interrogating the curriculum. There's so much more of that now than there was when I first started my career in 1998. No one was talking about culturally responsive teaching. If you had said that phrase to me, I would think like, what is that about? No one was talking about social and emotional learning. And so I think a win definitely is that there are more organizations now that are setting priorities around educational equity, and they're showing us how to do it, what it should look like, coming up with strategies to help teachers and students to do it. I think a challenge has to be that we're still fighting against the narrative that there is no such thing as systemic racism. And if there is no systemic racism, then it cannot be mirrored in our school system. And I think that it's taking a lot for us to get past that narrative. But I think that constant interrogation of the system will allow us to sort of break through that in the way that we need to for our students. And the more organizations, the more teachers who speak out, the more pre-service educators who have the opportunity to have these discussions, the better. We definitely haven't had the support at all those layers of our educational system. And I think that because of that, education has not been the great equalizer that Carter G. Woodson talked about. It has not been, because the system itself has inequities. And if you take something that's already inequitable and you try to apply it equally, you're not going to get an equitable system. And so that's really great and aspirational, but we're not there yet. So we have to keep questioning, keep interrogating what we're doing so that we absolutely make it to where Dr. Woodson wanted us to be.
Great points. Mr. Secretary, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Monica. I do try to draw hope from the folks who are challenging the inequities. But there are a lot of inequities. I mean, it is a daunting picture. I mean, the reality is that African American students are underrepresented in quality early childhood seats. So we have many students who arrive at kindergarten already behind. I mean, we've all had the experience of walking into kindergarten classroom, seeing the kid who's holding the book upside down because they've had so little exposure to language and reading. So we also see those same inequities in our K-12 system. And we did an analysis at EdTrust showed that we spend on average around the country about $2,000 less per student in districts that have large numbers of students of color compared to those districts that have very few students of color. African American students are less likely to get the strongest, best prepared teachers, less likely to have access to school counselors, less likely to be enrolled in advanced coursework like AP or International Baccalaureate or even 8th grade algebra, less likely to have support around transitions to post-secondary. And so all of these opportunity gaps lead to the gaps that we see in achievement and attainment. And what we do at EdTrust is try to challenge that. So I agree with Monica. We do have this moment, and I think the conversation last year, the sort of national reckoning with issues of racial justice, creates maybe a window for some change. And we have bright spots around the country. There are individual schools, district schools, charter schools that are getting phenomenal outcomes for low-income African-American students, and we ought to be learning from those schools and thinking about how to scale. We also ought to be challenging the systematic racial and socioeconomic segregation of our schools. There are communities that are doing that have models of effective integration, but again, we don't often take those things to scale. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Professor, your thoughts?
Yes. So there's certainly been some advancements since Woodson emerged on the national scene in 1915 with the establishment of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. So I wanted to kind of just look and see, what progress has been made. Today, 88% of Black Americans over age 25 possess a high school diploma, compared to 90% for the nation. That's good, but we need to close that other percent. And in 1940, only 7% of Blacks had a high school education compared to 24% for the nation as a whole. So that's certainly an advancement. Today, we have 26% of African Americans over the age 25 that possess a college degree or more, compared to 36% for the nation. Be great if we can close that gap. But that's some movement compared to where we were when Woodson was on the scene. There are certainly some challenges. Only 0.9% of Black Americans hold professional degrees in like law, medicine, and business. And there's another issue that we have a major challenge in, and it's something that John just mentioned. And as an educator, my concern is that of the shortage of African American teachers. Nationally, we know that the U.S. public schools have a critical shortage, as John mentioned, and we have 16% of public school students in the U.S. are Black, with only 7% of public school teachers being Black. And that's a major problem for several reasons. We know that Black children benefit from having good Black teachers. We also know that all children benefit from having good Black teachers. So this is something certainly that we need to focus on with laser-like attention.
All great points. In fact, you make me think about schools of education in particular. You're working at one right now, Professor. You worked there before, John. You went to Columbia, Monica. We know you have experience with education schools. You go back to the time that Carter G. Woodson was on the scene, as you mentioned. At least for a number of Black women, being a teacher, or we talked, Monica, I believe you talked about your mom being involved in medicine. Being a nurse or being a teacher was an avenue for African American men. Leadership positions came through our school system. Our HBCUs often were the large producer of teachers, many of them that had ed schools. Fast forward today, ed schools still produce a number of teachers today. There's some who come through alternative certification programs. Are there some things that we can do to either tweak the curriculum or maybe the outreach or something with ed schools to try to address some of the issues that you mentioned? Whoever wants to go first can.
Well, two things I would say. One is, it is still true that our best pipelines for African American teachers and for teachers of color generally are historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions. So we ought to double down on investing in those institutions. We also ought to be investing in community colleges, where a large share of Black and Latino students start, and we should be helping those students transition from 2-year programs into 4-year programs focused on education. So I'm hopeful. I think there's some energy around increased investment in HBCUs, certainly on the philanthropic side, more conversation in Congress. I hope that there will be more resources for those institutions targeted to the preparation of the teacher pipeline that we need. But then the second piece is, teacher prep institutions have to see this as core to their mission. Diversity isn't a nice to have. It's not an extra. It's not a thing that goes at the bottom of the list. It is a core function. And so these institutions need to do a lot more work to recruit diverse students. They need to do a lot more work to recruit diverse faculty. The faculty picture for teacher prep institutions is in many cases worse than school districts, a lower percentage of faculty of color. So we've work to do there to create environments that are positive and affirming for students of color. We have to look at the curriculum and say, are we ensuring that teacher preparation addresses diverse authors, diverse stories, prepares teachers to support students who've had experiences similar to their own and different from their own, prepares teachers to use alternatives to exclusionary discipline, things like restorative justice, prepares teachers to have conversation about the hard parts of our history, slavery, Jim Crow, Japanese American internment, right? So it's really a reorientation of teacher prep to what it means to have a successful multiracial democracy.
Thank you.
Yeah, so much of what you said really resonates with me, Secretary King. I think so my HBCU is exactly what you said. It was founded for that reason to it was a teachers college. So we had Lemoyne College and Owen College that merged, and let's get more teachers of color out there. And I think for me, I think about the things that drove so many of us at the time, both male and female, to want to go into education. And I think that there were really explicit, sort of planned out strategic ways to get us to see ourselves, as you said, in curriculum. And that's what really great HBCUs do. And all of them are really making strides in this way. And I think, as you said, more investment in these areas, more investment for education in general, but then having opportunities for high school students also to start thinking about this. So it's sort of a chicken egg situation. We have so many Black male students who have really not great experiences in school. And now when you think about where they are in the workforce, something like 2%. So I don't feel like going into a profession in which I felt as a student not welcome, not accepted. I didn't feel like I had a place. And so we have to really start to change the experiences that our Black students have in our classrooms so that they see education as a viable profession. I don't want to go into something that made me feel horrible most days because of discipline, because I didn't see myself in the curriculum. I remember having an experience at my high school where they, for career, it might have been like a career week, but they allowed us to, as upperclassmen, to be paired with elementary students or middle school students and teach lessons. And it was like, do you like that feeling? Do you like what it feels like to be a mentor? We have so many students who we think come from, poor, downtrodden places, who have so much to offer. So when we start tapping into that in an early in high school, in middle school, and allowing them to sort of share their gifts and their talents, that becomes something that they feel inspired to do. And so chicken egg, we have to think about the ways in which we're inspiring, the way we're allowing students to see themselves. And when we do that, they want to, as I did with Miss Elian, they want to replicate that and they want to go into this field and do it more. And so we have to keep investing, as you said, Secretary King, we have to keep providing opportunities for students to work together, keep interrogating our curriculum, updating our curriculum, and for our pre-service teachers, having this be a part of what they learn, and that they're not going into schools to teach content, they're teaching students. And the way to do that is to think about their cultural needs, their backgrounds, their social and emotional needs, and then teach your math, then teach your science. And so again, I think if we think about it in that way, we're going to hopefully have more teachers of color in the workforce. So we need them.
Thank you. Professor.
Yes, I would like to see, predominantly white universities and colleges become more assertive and aggressive in recruiting African Americans to the teaching profession. As you know, I work here in the School of Education at UVA, and my center interfaces with teacher education quite frequently. And we've been listening to middle school and high school teachers, students, and talking to them about the possibility of teaching as a profession. And one of the major issues that often comes up is they feel disconnected from the university. That's one. Number two, the second question they always ask, what's the curriculum like? Are we going to learn African American history? Or is the curriculum going to be diverse? All these types of issues come up. So I think universities like UVA can do more in terms of revising the curriculum to make it more inclusive, to address diversity issues, and to be more assertive in recruiting those students, and not waiting until they get to high school. I think we need to focus on identifying students and providing opportunities to bring them on campus, on grounds, when they're in middle school, and have them think about the profession very early on. My center at UVA is currently working with an organization called the African American Teaching Fellows to try to do just that. And so we'll be rolling out a program pretty soon, hopefully, depending on funding, how much funding we get, to start identifying students in middle school and not waiting. We want to be assertive and aggressive about it. We should be right in the middle of this with HBCUs, and then we can coordinate with HBCUs as well.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for talking about the role of HBCUs in the teacher profession pipeline. They make up less than 10% of the schools in the United States, but produce about a third of the teachers. Thanks also for talking about community colleges. You know, there was a study some decades ago, I believe from Carnegie, that identified that over 50% of the African Americans and Hispanics with a PhD got their start at a community college. I'm one who started at a community college as well. And you remind me also that at one point, but 15 years ago, UVA received a grant, the Curry School, to work with Piedmont, Virginia Community College for a program to actually encourage and work with aspiring teachers at the community college level. So it's definitely one sector we should continue. Monica, thanks so much for reminding us about the whole idea. If you can see it, you can be it, and how many young African-American students don't see us. And so when I finished college, HBCU as well, Howard University, it's always good to give some HBCU love. I became a fifth grade school teacher. And in fact, I talked to one of my fifth grade students a month ago after all of these years. And majority of them said I was the only African-American teacher they had, with the exception of someone in physical ed or PE or something. And no disrespect to that, it was just a dynamic. And so, yeah, encouraging people to see it, you can be it. I think that's so important. And, you know, Professor, the part you mentioned about trying to get students earlier, the idea of going to middle school, I like that. The National Science Academy decades ago partnered with, I believe, Ballou High School in DC to get high school students to think. But you're talking about middle school, and since you're talking about funding, you know, one of the things we do with this video is send it to some of our people, so I'll make sure that that's part of the marketing part. But I like that middle school piece. So, Mr. Secretary, let's turn to you. You, Secretary of Education, you were also a state chief in New York. You mentioned you were a teacher, you were also a principal. You know, how do the experience of being a principal and a teacher play a role in shaping your ideas about leadership and about, you know, regulation and policy once you became a secretary and a secretary?
Yeah.
Commissioner and a secretary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, a couple of things. One is, I think sometimes, and I know you've seen this, Gerard, in the different roles that you've played at the state level. Sometimes the folks who are in policy roles, you know, it's maybe been a while since they were in schools, or maybe they haven't been in schools at all, and there can sometimes be a disconnect between policy and practice. So I always found it helpful to have the perspective of having kind of been on the front lines, but I also tried to always make sure, whether it was at the state level or the federal level, that we had teachers and principals at the table as we were talking about policy issues to get that perspective, and actually students as well. And we tried to, you know, when I was secretary, we would have these regular kind of student engagement sessions to get feedback from students on policies. I remember one we did with students who'd experienced homelessness. And students were describing some of the challenges around applying for financial aid for college. And literally from that meeting, we went and made changes to the federal aid application process based on the feedback that we got from students. So that staying close to the ground, I think, is really important. A second piece is that, and this goes to something that Monica was saying, I think sometimes we in education tend towards these false dichotomies where we say you either care about academics or you care about relationships. Well, the reality is, if you don't have a relationship, it's very hard to make academic progress, right? You know, there's that saying, students don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? And the experience that you've had in the classroom as well, Gerard, is one that informs you that, yeah, we've got to attend to both things. So I think about now in this COVID moment, we're having a lot of conversation about tutoring. And to me, what's appealing about a national tutoring effort is, yes, we have to make up for the lost learning time, but it's also that opportunity to have a student connect with an adult, a mentor, someone who is going to have that relationship that's going to help them reconnect with school after this really difficult period of COVID where school's been so disrupted. So, you know, we also have this false dichotomy. Is it what happens in school that matters or what happens outside of school that matters? Well, you know, all of us who've been practitioners, we know if a kid is hungry, they're going to struggle to learn. If a kid can't see the board because they don't have glasses, they're going to struggle to learn. So of course the stuff outside of school matters, but also we have to make class compelling and engaging and interesting and fun and exciting. And we shouldn't have to choose between those. We have to have a strategy to try to tackle the community issues and the school issues.
Absolutely. Monica, let's go to you. Classroom teacher, you're now working with a company where you can train the next generation of teachers in classroom, preparing to be on how to work with students. Now, what's interesting is the school classroom today, 2021, it looks very different, feels very different than when some of the teachers, when they were in elementary school or in high school, it just looks different. How important is it to work with educators in preparing them to work with Black students, whether it's K all the way through high school?
Yeah, it is extremely important. I was just in a meeting with a couple of principals, and they were outlining some of their challenges around having teachers who don't look like their students driving from far away. And there's this disconnect that the teachers don't necessarily see that the students, as I said earlier, bring a wealth of knowledge into the classroom that they could be tapping into as they teach them. And so we were just talking through some of those challenges, but I think it is important for all teachers, for even Black teachers, to think really about the strategies that they're using to reach Black students, right? So it has to start not when the teacher shows up as a first year teacher and now let's go have some PD on this. And then a week or so, your kids are showing up. This has to be embedded in the curriculum in our pre-service programs. We have to make talking about systemic racism within the educational system a part of what we do. And we have to start talking about ways that you can dismantle that before you get to the classroom. So what does it look like at the classroom level to think about the policies you put in place, the procedures you put in place that sort of govern the way that your classroom runs and the way students feel in your classroom? How do you interrogate that and make sure that you're not doing that because the teacher down the hall did it, but you're doing it because it actually does benefit the students that are in there? And so often what keeps happening is that we wait until teachers are there, and then we start the work of saying, oh, we need some sessions on implicit bias. That needs to be happening before. And it also needs to be stated that it doesn't matter whether you are a teacher of color or a white teacher, we all have implicit bias. And we have to start thinking about the ways in which we bring those into the classroom in a harmful way without knowing that we're, not having the intent to harm students, but that we absolutely are. And so thinking about the ways that we discipline, the curriculum that we put in front of our students. I always say that students learn two things from what we teach them. We learn what's important, what's not important. We learn in literature who's important, who's not important. So if I'm only reading white authors, I'm telling my students, these are the authors who are important. This is where you find good knowledge, in these books, and not in these books that we keep on the margin for when you have extra time, right? And so we have to think about what those policies are at the school level, at the classroom level, and how we let teachers know that it's not just their responsibility to teach the curriculum, but it's their responsibility to also understand what those policies are and recognize when they're not equitable. So you don't get that from just showing up in the beginning. And I think that those strategies of thinking about policy, thinking about curriculum, thinking about the ways that we connect with students, communities, with their families, it doesn't just benefit Black students, it benefits all students, but it especially benefits, and we especially need it for Black students because for so long, we have not given that to them. My friend Africa, I saw her in the chat. She's on the panel or listening to us. We talk a lot about windows and mirrors, right? So giving students opportunities to see themselves in the curriculum, but also to learn something else too. That's a window that they're looking out of. And it's like, oh, I didn't know that. And so often with our Black students, we only give them windows. Let's teach you about other people who were important. And then when we talk about you, we'll make it be about the downtrodden. Let's just talk about slavery, or here's a book on gangs. So the more we do that at pre-service, where we make it a part of what teachers do, like it's not a separate thing. And to talk about it does not mean that you, or to not talk about it means that you're perpetuating the same system. We're never going to change it if we look at it as, I'm being defensive, they're calling me a racist, or they're saying I'm not a good person or a good teacher. But we all have to think about the ways in which we can take these little pieces, examine them, and make the whole system better. And it just doesn't happen when teachers show up. I have worked with teachers who've been in education a long time, and it's, they're 25 years in or 30 years in, and now someone is telling them to do this, and there's resistance. So we have to do away with that resistance early and often.
Great points. Professor, you get a chance to work with current and aspiring teachers, principals, superintendents, and scholars. How do you use your platform as a professor to prepare them to work with Black students?
Okay. So that's a great question. Thank you. I want to respond to that. And I want to also just kind of piggyback off something that Monica said about
Absolutely.
how we teach about Black history and Black studies in school. Something that really influenced me was said by my mentor many years ago, and his name is Dr. Asa Hilliard. He said, "You're going to be going to schools of education teaching teachers." He said, "Please teach your teachers, future teachers, to never begin the discussion about Black Americans with slavery. Always begin with Africa." And that was very profound. And it's something that I took with me, had in the back of my mind when I joined the African American History Education Commission that I'm going to talk some about later. But in that capacity, as both a co-chair for that commission that I just mentioned here in Virginia, as well as in my capacity as the director for the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, we try to really engage the issue of the teaching of African American history in a very substantive and serious way. And so we have a number of professional development opportunities where we not only bring in teachers, but we really try to recruit school principals, school leaders, school administrators to join us. Because one of the things that we're always told when we hold these professional development institutes is this: it would really be great if my principal could come here with me so they could see what I'm trying to do, right? And so every opportunity that I have to kind of use my platform when I'm speaking before groups of school leaders and school principals, I always encourage them to go to these professional development seminars and institutes to learn about African American history so that you'll understand what your teachers have learned when they go to these institutes. And so we're having one, my center has one every summer. Last year we had over 300 people to apply to the institute in 4 days, right? And we could only accept 150. And that told us something, that there's certainly an interest in this out there. There's a major interest in it. And so we need to really take advantage of that, get the word out, and let people know that there are institutes out there where you can teach, where you can learn about African American history, but school principals and leaders need to join us as well. So that's what I'm trying to do right now. That's kind of my bully pulpit, is to get principals involved in institutes for teaching African American history.
Great
I want
point.
to just say thank you for doing that, because so often I talk to teachers who want to do this work. They want to learn, they want to do better and make their classrooms more inclusive. And they feel as though it's just in the four corners of their classroom, and they don't know if they have that support of the leader in the building. And I think that has to be stated, right? I love that you said that and that you're doing this work, Derrick. It has to be said at the school level, this is what we believe about all of our students. Here are the ways in which we're going to do it. Stop just putting the mission on a sheet of paper and posting it in classrooms, but actually having action steps that make sure. I always ask teachers and principals, how do you know? Like, right, how do you know it's working? So what are the steps that let you make sure that that thing is actually happening? And if we're expecting teachers to only do this at the classroom level, that's not systemic change. It has to start with the leaders in the building saying, this is a priority, here is how I will support you. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it is crucial to the work.
I'm very, thanks for saying that. And I have to mention this, I can't hold it back. And one of the recommendations that the African American History Education Commission made was that school principals, superintendents, and school leaders should attend these institutes, professional development institutes on the teaching of African American history with their teachers. That was the first recommendation.
Okay.
And guess what? It has passed. It's waiting to go to the governor. bipartisan support in Virginia. All of our recommendations passed. So that's one that we're very happy about.
I definitely want to come back to the commission you were on, because people don't often have any insight into how committees put together recommendations, how they ultimately get to a governor. So we'll definitely come back. And as you're doing, feel free to weigh in on respond to each other's points. Let me go back to you, Mr. Secretary. You've taken your professional and personal cachet to the area of criminal justice reform. We had a chance to do an event together on Capitol Hill. You've done op-eds, but you've also had conversations with people across the world, across the US about this. What attracted you to criminal justice reform, and how does education play a role in it?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad for the things we've been able to do together on this. You know, education and our criminal justice system are deeply interconnected. You know, a disproportionate share of the folks who are incarcerated don't have high school diplomas. A disproportionate share of folks who are incarcerated are struggling readers. So the inequities in our education system often translate into involvement in our criminal justice system. You know, we have the challenge of the school to prison pipeline, where we have significant discipline disparities beginning with pre-K. African American students are more than 3 times likely to be suspended from pre-K, 4-year-olds suspended. And so, you know, we have this pipeline that starts there. We have 1.7 million kids who go to a school in this country where there's a sworn law enforcement officer and no school counselor. Right? So we have this system that is designed in some ways to steer people into the criminal justice system. So as we think about then, once people are involved in the system, what happens? And too often, our system is defined only by punishment, by folks serving their time, as opposed to thinking about how do we ensure that people, when they come out, are better prepared to be successful when they come home. 95% of the folks who are incarcerated are coming home. So it's in everyone's interest to make sure that they come home with skills. And so one of the things that I worked on when I was secretary, that I've continued to work on as an advocate since, is this issue of access to higher education in prisons. And as you know, Gerard, the 94 crime bill, there were many problems in the 94 crime bill, many bad policies. One of the particularly bad policies was banning access to Pell Grants for folks who are incarcerated. And when that happened, Pell Grants, you know, are the main funding source for low-income students to access higher education. When that ban was put in place, hundreds, if not thousands of programs around the country closed overnight. And we lost this opportunity to help people get access to education. So during the Obama administration, we created a pilot program to allow 65 colleges and universities to partner with prisons to provide higher education programs paid for by Pell Grants. We launched that pilot, and when you, as you've done, I know, Gerard, when you meet with the students, it's transformative for them, transformative for their families. Prison wardens are huge supporters of this. They will say it's transformative for the prison because it creates a sense of hope and purpose, not only for the students, but also for folks who don't have a high school diploma, because now you see a reason, okay, if I get my GED, I'll be able to enroll in these college programs, and that will be a path to opportunity. So, you know, there weren't many things with which I agreed with my successor, Secretary DeVos, but this was actually one where she actually continued the program and expanded it. And we continued to advocate with folks directly impacted who are just very compelling advocates for this program. And in the December stimulus bill, that ban on Pell Grants for folks who are incarcerated was repealed. It's a major achievement, legislative achievement. And I really credit the folks who were directly impacted for it, because they were the ones who moved legislators and governors. And that was a powerful and important moment, but we have a lot more work to do to make sure that we get barriers out of the way so that folks who've been impacted by the criminal justice system aren't then locked out of educational opportunity. And we actually are about to launch an EdTrust, a Justice Fellows program, where we'll have fellows on our higher ed team who have been involved in the criminal justice system, have pursued higher education, and now want to be a part of moving policy to help ensure access to and success in post-secondary education for folks who've been involved in the criminal justice system.
Great points, and definitely look forward to following. Are you going to launch the fellowship in the next month or so?
Yeah, we've selected the fellows. We're about to launch, and I'm going to make sure you come and speak with them.
Sounds good. Monica, I'm going to pivot to you. You said a couple of things that were really interesting as it relates to working with teachers of colors and also whites. So a couple of years ago, there was a paper produced to say that Black students who had a Black teacher had, 1.5-year gain, in readings and gains in math. So my white friends who felt comfortable in conversation said, so do I read this to say that as a white teacher, I'm having no impact on Black students? And then I also had my Black friends who phenotypically Black say, I'm working with low-income students and I grew up in a very middle-class home, so there's some class dynamics that are also in place. You're working with teachers, you're doing this stuff. How do you respond to that? How should we think about that? Because for some teachers, both Black and white and teachers of color, it's tough.
Yeah, I think that that the data you just shared speaks to just the very presence of having someone who looks like you, like what the positivity that can come from just that. I also, as I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned earlier, that even Black teachers need to do this work, right? Because I can walk into a room where everybody's brown like me, but that doesn't mean that we have had the same experiences. But I think that there is something about the mirror that a Black teacher having someone, when I first had Miss Elian, right? I hadn't had any other Black teachers before. There's something that says, it clicks in my mind that, okay, this is someone who gets me. I don't know if any of you, and you probably have, and many people who are watching us have had a student, Black student, white student, any student say to us, you don't know me, right? You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. Like when they're angry, you don't know me. And what that means is that I don't see the connection. And sometimes that very baseline connection is the thing that a student needs, that perhaps this person knows a little bit more of my experience. Maybe they don't, but perhaps they do, right? And so I think just starting with the fact that for white teachers, not that, no, of course you don't have to see that the work that you're doing has no impact or has very little impact. It just means you have a little bit more work to do to make those connections, perhaps. And perhaps you don't, because I have met Black teachers who have had a hard time making connections for the very reason you said. There's a socioeconomic gap that they just can't understand the backgrounds of the students that they're teaching. And so I don't think that there is an end all be all right answer to that. I think that we all have to keep doing the work. We all have to, I can't show up and think that because I have brown skin that I automatically have that. Maybe I will, but even if you get it initially, students will make you keep proving that. So I think that it's not enough for a Black teacher to rest in that, to sit back in that and to say, I have this coming in. What are the steps that you're going to take to make sure that that's not all? Because that's very surface level. But what are the things that you're doing to make sure that you keep those connections, you keep building, you sustain that? And for white teachers, how are you educating yourself to figure out what you don't know? To go into a classroom with students of color, knowing that you don't know everything that you need to know. Perhaps you're really great in your content, but what is it that you don't know about educating this particular group of students? What new strategies might you need to try that you never tried before? What connections might you need to allow them to make with each other? What concessions might you need to make when you walk in, and let them know, hey, I'm a teacher who doesn't look like you, but I'm here to learn. I always, even with Black students, walked in and said to them, I'm Monica Washington, or Monica Wilson back then. I'm your teacher this year, but I'm also a student. You're my students, but I want you to know that you also are my teachers. And so when we think about it in that way, whether we are a teacher of color or a white teacher, not resting in our brown skin as, hey, I've got this, thinking about the work that we still have to do. And with white teachers, also thinking about always trying to figure out what are they doing for self to make sure that they're filling in those gaps that they are just naturally going to come in with.
Great points. So Professor, let's go back to you and do a deeper dive on the commission. Talk to us about how it was formed. You chaired one of the subcommittees. You've given us one recommendation, but talk to us about what you learned, also about how this impacts curriculum for all students in Virginia who are going to be reading about Black history.
Yes, yeah, it was an exciting experience. I think we worked a period of 18 months.
Okay.
I was the uh, chair of the professional development um, subcommittee, and we had Dr. Atkins, who is the superintendent of Charlottesville City Schools, was the chair of the commission, and Cassandra Newby Alexander at Norfolk State was the co-chair for the standards part. But we worked very closely together. We worked very hard, and I'll have to admit, we went into the process with a little. We weren't sure whether this was going to get lost in the mix or not.
Sure.
But after we had the first meeting, Secretary Carney and the governor, Governor Northam, told us, you know, shoot for the sky. Don't hold back. Don't worry about whether or not you don't think it will a recommendation will fly. Just what do you think we need to do in the Commonwealth of Virginia in terms of training teachers so that they are ready for teaching, they're prepared to teach African American history. So after 18 months, we came up with a number of recommendations. The standards subcommittee made a number of recommendations that are going to be accepted. And I'd just like to tell you a few and how they're going to impact. Our recommendations included, is one I mentioned earlier, was to revise Virginia teachers' evaluations regulations and its uniform performance standards for school leaders to include cultural proficiency efficacy. So that's a done deal. That's gonna happen.
Okay.
And so all school leaders will be evaluated in the area of cultural proficiency. And one part of that evaluation will hopefully be to require them to be involved in professional development as it pertains to issues of diversity, what have you. Every teacher that gets their licensure renewed will have to have a course or credit continuing education unit in African American history. So that's going to happen. Also, students in Virginia will be required to take for graduation a credit in African American history. So those are just a few. And I was surprised that there was not a lot of resistance to this in our town hall meetings that we had across the Commonwealth. And what we found instead, that there were a number of people who came out in support of what we were talking about recommending. And this support was coming not only from African American teachers and their families, but also from other groups, white Americans, Latinos, what have you, Asians. They came out and said, look, this is very important. We live in a state that has a long history of Jim Crow. We have a population of people who have been historically oppressed. And I believe that it is now time for us to talk about this issue. So we're very impressed. So what does this mean? That means that schools of education and other entities will need to step up to the plate and begin to offer professional development opportunities for teachers and school leaders. That was a major concern. Are there enough opportunities? And one of the questions I remember very well, someone said, well, I live in Roanoke. How am I going to get to these universities to get these credits? And so we have to make it accessible, right? So what we're doing with our equity certificate at the University of Virginia, my center and curriculum instruction, is we're going to offer the certificate completely online. So that students not only in the Commonwealth can take these courses, but around the country and around the world can obtain the certificate. So that's going to be very important. It's not just universities, but institutes and other organizations can offer this professional development as well. It'll have to be approved. It hasn't gotten that far yet, but that's going to be something that you're going to see take place pretty quickly as people try to get their licenses renewed.
I mean, that's a major win because you talked about the fact that some people may have been reticent to say, no, I'm not sure, but the fact that people are more open and the fact that we'll get this codified school, well, here, the Board of Education will have to do its part. But the fact that educators, will this become effective 2022?
We hope so. Yeah.
Oh, all right. I'm sure.
And let me just say something about the course for high school students. I haven't heard about that yet, but I think it's going to happen. So let me backtrack and say, let's hold off on that. But we do know that endorsement in history and African American history that's happening. That's passed with bipartisan support.
Are we one of the first states to do this?
I've been asked this many times. We did a lot of research before we went down this path to see if there were other states. I'm not aware of a state that's done this before us. I might be wrong, but you telling me something new if you told me.
Okay.
Because we were looking to gain some insights to how other states did it, right?
Okay.
And so we just weren't able to locate.
Well, this is definitely the kind of stuff Education Commission for the states would love to learn about, because they can use it throughout their work. I've just got one last question for all of you. It's a big picture question, and then once all of you answer, we'll open it up for an audience Q&A. For those of you who are on, I haven't looked in the chat box yet for questions, so you can use your electronic hand and I will call on you. And if there's no hands raised, I'll just go to the chat, look for questions. So this is the big thing question. So for you, Mr. Secretary, what's the one big thing in the area of public policy that we should do to improve learning outcomes for Black students? For Monica, what's the big thing as it relates to preparing teachers? And then for you, Professor, what's the big thing as it relates to preparing the next generation of scholars? And so, Monica, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just have to really say really quickly what Derrick just shared about the this program of having these equity certificates at a broader scale. Josh Parker in the chat was talking about what are some of these systemic ways, some of these big policy changes that we can make, and that's definitely doing my heart well to hear that that's happening. So to that point, to many of the points that you made, I think definitely going back to, if there's a big thing, pre-service teachers have to, as I was like beating this drum today, have to have this training around what it means to be inclusive, what it means to be responsive, what it means to challenge systems, and how does it look to a teacher or to a student when a student walks into a classroom? How do we know that that student feels as though that they have an inclusive space to learn in? What do you do as a teacher to make that happen? How do you interrogate the curriculum? How do you audit your library selection that you have in your classroom? How do you do that? What do you do? How do you challenge your own classroom policies? How do you keep asking yourself year after year? So it has to be woven into our professional development early and throughout the career, not just spotty. We have to be talking about equity and cultural responsiveness throughout the school year. Every faculty meeting needs to have an equity spotlight of some sort. We have to have these conversations. And so for pre-service teachers, it has to start early and it has to continue. They have to see it as a part of what they do. It shouldn't be that, in 2025, a teacher is going into a classroom and they haven't really had any training. And so the more we do that, the more we open up space for teachers to talk to each other, to realize that they all will be learners for the entire period that they are teachers, and they're not just givers of information, but they are supposed to constantly develop themselves. Mm-hmm. That's the big thing. It's just making sure that our teachers know going in the door that they are lifelong learners and that they should be constantly questioning, constantly changing, and trying to meet the needs of their students, and that they will mess up. And it is not a bad thing to mess up, but it's a bad thing to not try to fix it. For our leaders to give space for that is also really important for our teachers to keep growing. So that would be my one big thing. We have to have that training early, have it often, have it throughout, give teachers the space they need to challenge these systems, and let it be a part of the culture of education, because it's not the culture of education for teachers to ask questions and to challenge. It is the nature of education for us to go with the flow. So the more we do that in really formalized ways, for me, it was getting with another group of teachers and saying, we're going to be the group of teachers in the school that will take other teachers' challenges to our leaders, and we'll talk about it in that way. So just thinking about what we can put on paper as a system and how we can keep working through it, changing it, refining it, but start early. We can't let our teachers keep showing up and going, oh, I have to do what? Right? They have to know that before they get there.
Thank you. Secretary, your big thing.
Yeah, there's definitely no sort of silver bullet, but I would say the way we fund our schools in the United States is just upside down. We spend the most on the students who have the most advantages, and we spend the least on the students who face the greatest challenges. And so I would want to get to a system of equitable distribution of resources. We should be spending much more in our districts that are serving our highest needs students to make sure that all students have access to quality early learning, well-prepared teachers, a full range of courses in their school buildings, counselors, mental health services. Like that should be the floor. We should expect for every child what we would want for our own. Right. And until we get to that sort of equitable distribution of resources, we're going to be denying really equality of opportunity in our country.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, I'm gonna go back to my teachers. I would encourage our country to make the teaching profession attractive to African Americans, to African American students. And my suggestion would be a GI Bill of sorts for all who are interested in pursuing teaching as a profession. And I believe that if you do that, you will attract more African Americans into the teaching profession. You know, I talk to a lot of potential teachers about this, and they say, you know, it's just, I'm not going to make a lot of money as a teacher. However, you know, I really respect teachers, and they, you know, they talk just the way at the beginning. They talk about teachers that influence them. However, I think that people would make the commitment if a commitment was made to them to help them obtain those degrees. Again, there's a project here in Charlottesville called the African American Teaching Fellows that we do some work with here at UVA in the School of Ed. It would be great if we could offer those fellows a full ride to UVA.
Okay.
I mean, so at the end of the day, it still comes down to finances, right?
Okay.
That's major. So that would be my policy recommendation, to really put some teeth into that.
Thank you. So for those of you who are ready to join, I've picked up a couple of questions. I also had one that was sent to me in advance from someone who couldn't make it. Feel free to raise your electronic hand. And in the interim, I'll raise the question, at least one that I've seen in the chat box. Someone wants to know, what can we do in terms of procedure and work at the actual school site level to improve outcomes? What can we do at the school site level alone? That's open for anyone.
I think we have to tease out what we do with students into several buckets, right? So what are the policies that we have in our school? What are the programs that we have in our school? What does instruction look like in our school? What's our relationship with the community? And what's our relationship with our students? And I think it's impossible to work on all the things at the same time, but I think that we need to strategically plan around how we make movement in each of those buckets. So starting with like a really honest and open discussion about where we are, giving teachers an opportunity to say what that looks like for them in all of those buckets. Because so often when we send out the school survey and we know it's attached to a certain computer, and so teachers tell you what you want to hear. But I think we have to really get honest and allow students, allow teachers, allow families, allow our community members to say what our experiences are in these various buckets that really make up the school itself. And then we have to have a plan around how we're moving in each of those areas. So if I'm working on school programs, right? So what are the programs? Who are the students who normally get into these programs, whether it's AP, advanced courses, whatever enrichment courses? How do we communicate about that? How are we making sure that all students have access to these? and asking ourselves those questions, and then look for those gaps. What students are we serving in all of these areas? What students might we not be serving? And when we figure out who we're not serving, we come up with an action plan to better serve them, better communicate with them, let them know what's available in the school. But I think we have to think about it in that way. What are the policies? What are the programs? What's our curriculum looking at like? How do we build relationships and sustain relationships, and how are we doing that with our communities as well? And we have to have actionable plans with people's names next to bullets. This is what you're responsible for, and then here is when we're going to check in again to see how we're doing and figure out whether or not these things are working. And if it's not, we're going to go back to the drawing board. But we can't get caught up in this is what we've always done, and we're going to carry over from last year what we did to this year. Even from one semester to the next, you may have to make a change. So always looking at what we're doing and asking why we're doing it, who we're serving, and who we're not serving.
Got it. Here's a question that I received from someone who said they couldn't make it. She wants to know, are we sending too many Black students to college? Her perspective is too many are going to college, finding themselves in remediation, often having to leave, and they have debt. Should we also focus on sending Black students to the workforce or to something else? Should it be just college? Can it be the workforce or a combination? Whoever wants to take that one.
I wouldn't say that I would say we need to send more Black students to college, and we also need to prepare more Black students for success in careers. I wouldn't put them against each other. And in fact, I think if we do the career part well, often those are students who then continue on in their post-secondary education. So the reality is today, with just a high school diploma, it is very hard to find a good job that is going to allow you to support a family. So we need more. We need a post-secondary credential. When we think about those career credentials, we should be thinking about high quality credentials that are tied to 21st century jobs. Too many of the career tech ed programs serving particularly communities of color are training folks for jobs that used to exist. You know, you walk into the auto shop and they don't have any computers. Well, cars today all have computers. So if you have a good auto shop, it's going to have computers. Otherwise, you're training students for jobs that used to exist, right? So we should be adapting our career and technical education in ways that connect more directly to post-secondary higher ed institutions. The best example is that I know of is a program that started in Brooklyn called P-Tech. Now, students at P-Tech, they graduate with a high school diploma, an associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM. And P-Tech has been replicated around New York State with different employer partners. But the idea is you've got to connect all three pieces, the K-12, the higher ed partners at P-Tech, they work with City University of New York, and the employer at the table. And they are all participating in the design of the program, and students are getting access to not only that first job, but really a career path that could lead them to much higher earnings over time.
Great points. And we often overlook CTE, and a lot of our students, in fact, are using that to find themselves in the pathway to the middle class. Professor, you want to jump in?
I think Secretary King responded adequately, more than adequately. So I'll go ahead.
Oh, okay. Monica, anything for you? You're all good. Here's a question. What can districts do to keep and support game-changing educators they have now? The person said recruiting is one thing, but once you have them, what can districts do to keep them and to support them?
I'll take a stab at that one. And I'm going to speak some from my own personal experience. My wife is also a teacher, and just my relationship that I've had based on my relationship and conversations I've had with teachers. One of the things that they often talk about is the lack of autonomy they have in the classroom to be a professional, to exercise what they learned in college as a scholar, as an intellectual, right? And we know that teachers once had this, not to be overly romantic about, but those teachers that I'm working with and the teachers in the Movement Project who taught during the civil rights period, they all express having a great amount of autonomy to really be thinkers and scholars and to do what they wanted to in their class within a framework. But teachers have very little time to do that. And they're often on task. They need to be doing this at 1:30, this at 2 o'clock. And that just doesn't, that doesn't feel like a professional job to many people who are in the field of education or teachers. So I think that's one thing that we should step back and think about, how to bring professionalism back to the field of teaching.
Great points. And the secretary, go ahead. You just
Oh
said,
yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with Professor Aldridge, and that theme of teacher autonomy is actually touched on in a report that I put in the chat, which is a report we wrote at EdTrust in partnership with Teach Plus, where we interviewed teachers of color around the country and asked about their experience. And we wrote this report, If You Listen, We Will Stay. And there were these very clear patterns. One of the patterns that we saw was what I sometimes call the invisible tax on teachers of color, where African-American male teachers are expected to be the disciplinarian, the Latina teachers expected to translate for families, where teachers of color are expected to be the voice of diversity on the staff, sort of like hey, John, what are we doing for Black History Month this year? That sort of experience. And so what teachers said was, in many ways, they didn't necessarily mind taking on these additional responsibilities, but they wanted them to be compensated and recognized. And they didn't want the assumption to be that making sure the school was a healthy, diverse environment was just the responsibility of people of color on the staff. That really needed to be an institutional responsibility. People also called out, if the curriculum is not representative, that's demoralizing and frustrating for teachers. If the discipline policies in the school result in disparate harm to students of color, that's demoralizing and dispiriting for teachers. And so there was this sense that teachers of color are carrying the weight of the ways in which our institutions are falling short of serving kids of color well. And so that I commend the report to folks and encourage folks to think about this question, because the reality is teachers of color are leaving the profession at a higher rate than white teachers. So we have to solve both the pipeline and the retention problem.
for those who are going to see this later, who won't have access to the chat, what's the name of the report?
They can find the report at edtrust.org, and it's called If You Listen, We Will Stay.
Got it. Monica?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the time and I know we're getting close, but everything that these gentlemen just said times 10, absolutely. That weight piece that Secretary King is mentioning is so hard. And I'll just add to, as a teacher of color, that one thing that is really detrimental to teachers of color feeling that they can stay in a space is sometimes this sort of false voice that you can have. So what I mean by that is that sometimes there are surveys, sometimes a principal may ask you, but we never see what happens with that. And so I think that if we are getting the voices of our teachers, we're finding out what it is that they need, what is it that they don't have, how we can better support them while they're there, that they need to see that in action somewhere. It needs to show up somewhere. And so teachers that I work with, and then I'm speaking from my own experience, sometimes I don't know where that goes, and I don't see that it lives anywhere. It didn't live anywhere for the rest of this school year. I didn't see you do anything with what I told you in the next school year. And so we continue this cycle of being frustrated. So we have to show that we're not only gathering voices, but that we're using those voices to inform our decisions that we're making for our teachers, for our students. But absolutely everything that Secretary King and Professor Alridge just said, I wholeheartedly agree with. And the teachers who are leaving, before they get out of the door, we need to sit down with them and have a conversation and say, hey, I realize that this particular place or this particular profession wasn't right for you. What could we have done? We know you're gone, but what could we have done so that we can use that to make sure that we're retaining the teachers who have so much talent and they're still in our buildings?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, Monica, we're nearing the end. And so what I want to do is thank all of you who had a chance to participating in this live. I want to thank all of you who are going to download this later. Secretary King, let me first of all thank you for being with us. Thank you for still continuing to push for education in the role you have right now as President and CEO of Education Trust. Thank you for mending, and I would say actually blending, criminal justice and education, public policy procedures, because oftentimes we walk in lanes and we don't cross over. And you're making it safe for people to cross over and have the conversations. So thank you for that. And within the tradition of what Dr. Carter G. Woodson would do, you're actually taking what you know and making it practical. Monica, thank you so much for sharing all the work that you've done, not only in the classroom, but what you're doing right now to train the next generation of teachers. Thank you for speaking truth to the aspect of the window and the mirror. We often forget that. The aspects of class dynamics that also play a role in education, but also saying that we are lifelong learners. You know, teachers are learners, and you're going to do this for a really long time. Thank you again for the work you've done, and you don't, become the 2014 State Teacher of the Year for a big state like Texas without being thorough and competent and visionary. So, congratulations on that. And in the tradition of a Dr. Carter G. Woodson, you're an educator, and so you're moving that forward. Professor, thank you so much for the work that you do, not only being entrepreneurial in terms of bringing in a grant from the Spencer Foundation to support your center, but not just working with teachers who are in the classroom, but getting wisdoms from teachers who are involved in the civil rights movement, so that we can have a generation of people who can learn something from people who have more gray hair than some of us on the video right now. But also they've been through this, and often at a point that was much more segregated, where the law often didn't allow them to have conversations like this, safety, the Klan. You talk about this, and so thank you for me, bridging that gap with history. Also, thank you for using your intellectual heft to bring that to a statewide commission, which is now going to influence, nearly 2 million students that we have here in Virginia who are in our schools. Also, those who are in private schools in Virginia are going to benefit from it. So will the large homeschool population that we have. And your certificate program is going to be very great. For those of you, make sure you go to his website. He's also a scholar of Dr. Du Bois, and he's also talked about history and hip hop. So you should look at that as well. And in the spirit of a Dr. Carter G. Woodson, using your intellectualism to raise the conversation about American life. Again, this is Gerard Robinson. I want to thank all of you for participating in another session here for the Center for Education, Leadership, and Culture. Our next event will take place in March. It'll be the last Wednesday of the month, and it is Women's History Month. And we're going to talk about the education of women and girls in the United States. Thank you, everyone, for your time. And let's make sure we move forward what we're doing for Black students and those who work with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
So great.